Thank you very much. Our family are not actually considered pioneers. We moved here in 1946. You would be surprised that we were way down on the list when it comes to the pioneers. However, I have a very interesting family, and it took them quite a bit to get here. But I want to talk about my Aunt Mamie Sherrod. She grew up on a farm on the plains of Kansas, and I was bringing her home to spend some time with Dad, as she lived in Castle Rock. I was in Denver at that time. And we got to talking about one thing and another, and then she finally said, so much has happened in my life. She says, I was born on the plains of Kansas, and I went out and picked up cow chips in order to burn inside the house, in order to keep warm, because there was no trees. And she said, and now men are walking on the moon. And that was in the 1970s. And I want to give you a sense of how short that history was that we're talking about here. That it's only probably, it's only probably, the allergies are awful right now. It's only probably about 2 generations, maybe 3, but that is a very short thing. And then I want to talk about the Homestead Act, and that was in 1862. It was an idea that started with President Jefferson and finally put into, finally signed by President Lincoln, and that was in 1862. This is probably a piece of legislation that changed America more than anything else and made us so much different than all the other countries, because we turned over to people who were willing to go out and claim 160 acres, work that land for 7 years until it became theirs. And what is interesting, when I went back and studied the Homestead Act, is only about 40% of the homesteaders actually were able to complete that 7 years. Things happened along the way. So I want to talk about these really, really hard-working, and I mean really, really hard-working people, like my aunt, who settled this country 160 acres at a time. Of course, this changed the whole culture that was in here, which were the Indians. And the Indians could not understand why we were dividing this up in 160 acres. I mean, this didn't make sense to them because they were such spatial people and moved around. So I want to honor them too, because they were here for so very, very long. But also the other thing about the Indians that is so different from all the other countries is that the Indians could never be enslaved. They would never work for us. They would not work on the farms, they would not work on the ranches, they would not work inside the house. Not like the Africans when they went into Africa. So different. And so these 2 things, I hope I'm not giving a lecture. I'm a history buff. These 2 things really changed America more than anybody really realizes, and we need to honor both of them. I want to recognize Charlene Stees over here. She gave me information about the Cullens and the Trolls. So I want to talk about the area where I grew up, which is on the Sherrod Ranch. And so if you would go down 129, and when you come to Cullens Corner, if you will turn left instead of going around the corner and go up to 44, turn right, and the first place after the Cullens, the first place you come to then would have been Jenny and Chester Hitchens. Then you'd go around and cross the bridge and then you would come to the Carters on the left and the Sherrods on the right, and then you come to the corner where the Fly Gulch Road is, and the Fly Gulch schoolhouse was there. And then across the river were the Trolls. And so I'm bringing out these 2 families because they were in here in the 1880s and 1890s. and they were an important part of building this community out there where I grew up. The Cullens came in the 1880s. The Trolls, which I didn't know until I talked with Charlene, she's my history on this particular part, is they came in the 1890s. Both families had a number of tragedies while they were here. In the case of the Cullens, excuse me, in the case of the Cullens, John Cullen, who was 5 years old, the Cullens had come to town. They lived on the other side of the river. The Cullens had come to town on the 4th of July. It had rained really hard, and so Elk River had raised. And so when they went back home across the river, John Cullen was swept off the wagon and never found. And so these were stories that Mr. Carver used to come to our house and tell when we were young. Scared the holy bejesus out of me. Because you didn't want to be going across the Elk River unless you knew that it was safe. There was a rock in the river that was between the Hitchens and the Cullens that we would look at during the high water. If the water was going over that rock, you didn't dare cross the river. If it was just kind of going over, you would be taking your life in your hands, but you might get across. My daddy I shouldn't say my daddy, excuse me, Jackie. Our daddy loved to test that river. He had a big stallion, and if he thought it was crossable, he would take that stallion and they would find a way across the river, because the rocks would roll. And so the crossing would never be the same from one year to the next. And so the horse would take his time, go across, find his way, get across. And then he'd come back and report to us whether we could or could not cross it. I was not ever, I had to a couple of times cross it when it was really high, but I was not ever going to go out there on my own. My brothers, yes, but I wouldn't. So then the next family would be Jenny Hitchens. Jenny and Chester and Jenny Hitchens. Jenny and Denny Cullen were brother and sister. They were part of that was part of the big Cullen family that came into the 1880s. I understand from Charlene that they probably ran a herd of cattle in here. That's how they made their money, which is how a lot of people, when they first came in, was to bring in big herds of cattle. Then the Carvers around the corner, they were very quiet and didn't know too much about them, but I do know is that Mrs. Carver bought the ranch in probably about 1920. Her brother was in World War I, and he had an insurance policy, and he was killed in World War I. So the money from the insurance policy bought the Carver Ranch. And then the next was the Perry Clark Ranch, which ended up being the Sherrod Ranch later. And then the school that is now over at the middle school, the Fly Gulch School, right there on the corner of where Fly Gulch comes in and the 44 and Highway 44. And across the river were the Trolls. So the Trolls, in order to get to town, oftentimes had to cross the river over to our place and then take because the roads would be so bad. But that is a neighborhood. So this is the neighborhood I'm going to be talking about. And so the Cullens and the Trolls were the first ones in. And I didn't know, in fact, talked to Charlene, that they were related, that they were cousins. I knew that Denny and Jenny were brother and sister, but I didn't know the Trolls were cousins. The Trolls also had a lot of tragedy. The town of Troll was in that area. It was not exactly where Lois and Frank lived. It was across the river. And that is where the stage stop was. And they would come down, the stage would stop there, and then it would go up to where 44 is, and then go on to Hayden. The Trolls had 4 children, one in 1919 or 1918, when the epidemic came through. And In 5 days, 3 of their children had died.
Oh my gosh.
And they were buried above our ranch, or the Sherrod Ranch, in what became, it's now called the Elk River Out Mountain Cemetery. At that time, it was named the Trawl Cemetery because of the children that were buried there. So both of these families, that begins to tell you how difficult it was to settle this country. There's one other family that I'm going to talk about. I don't know their names, and that's unfortunate. I ran the county records about 25 years ago. On the property, right at the foot of Elk Mountain, was a cabin, and I never quite knew who the people were, but when I went through the county records, I found that there was a family that lived there that when they went in, it was a husband and wife and 3 children. They built the cabin. I think they had a dairy farm there. I'm not sure. I can't imagine up that high up in the mountains having a dairy farm. But I think they did. And then the next thing I saw in the county records was the death certificate of the husband. And then the next thing I found was that the lady was staying with the Trawls, and she now had 4 children. So she was obviously pregnant when, or I'm assuming it didn't drop out of the sky. She was pregnant when her husband was killed. And then she went and lived with the Trawls. That record showed that. And then she ended up in Pueblo. And that meant that she was sent to a mental institution. That's what happened to women when they could not take care of themselves because they become, quote unquote, hysterical. I don't know what happened to the children. I've not been able to find anything on these people. I just know what I read in the county records, and I saw the cabin as I was growing up. So this gives you some sort of an idea of how difficult it was to settle this country. And it really was, particularly if you were living out in the country rather than in town. In town, you had more services out there, but also to really show that that woman had to go to a mental institution. There was no safety net. There was no help unless she could have lived with families, or unless another man would have taken her in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the early people who came into that area where I grew up. And I just wanted to kind of acknowledge them and acknowledge their gift and what they gave to us as a community. I'm gonna have a drink of water. Okay, the next person I want to talk about is Perry Clark. And Perry Clark came to Steamboat in 1905. Now, I don't know what happened in Steamboat in 1905, but there just was a lot of activity. That's when the Legabees came in, that's when the Lights came in. I think that's probably when the Heights came in. Anyway, there was a lot of activity going on at that time. And Perry Clark was one of the ones who came in. He was from New York City. I'm going mostly from county records and also letters that we found on the ranch. So he came in and he had family money. He set up, or the family set up, the Clark Land and Stock Company before he left New York. And then he came out in New York, and I don't know how he found the ranch. Anyway, he wanted to be where there was a lot of really good hay meadow, I'm guessing, because he purchased 4 of the homesteads. I don't any longer remember what the names of those people were. I'm sure that one of them was Fly, because that's Fly Gulch out there. And I'm sure that was one of them. But he purchased 4 of them for approximately $6,000 a piece. So that's $24,000. And I can't imagine in 1905 how we can compare that to what it would be right now, but it would have been a lot of money. You have to realize that that land was some of the richest land along Elk River, because that was where that long meadow is. And Lois Trollope used to say that is where the Indians raced, down that long meadow. And that would be where the Sherrod Ranch is now, and where the Robinson Ranch is. I see it now is for sale. All along there is where it was called the Indians Racetrack. And I remember as a kid, all those trees along there, when it would get to be 50 below zero, those trees pop. And you could hear this eerie sound of the trees popping. And Daddy, I would kind of look like this, and Daddy loved to tease me because I was so sensitive. He would say, "That's the ghost Indians racing." but that was it. That was there. So he bought those 460-acre tracts for approximately $24,000. And then the next thing we began to know about him is the letters that were coming from the family. "Perry, where is our money?" What they didn't realize, what Perry didn't realize, and people who are ranchers do realize, it's really hard to make a living in this country as a rancher. You have so many months of snow and so few months of grassland. So anyway, there was a box of letters, and almost every one of them was his sister Sarah said, "Where is our money?" Oh, I forgot one thing. I need to backtrack here. When Perry came here, he had, because it was a family stock company, he had his sisters come out, and they filed on land all around the Oak Mountain area so that it was contiguous with what he purchased in the valley. And so it ended up being approximately an 1,800-acre ranch. And that, for a ranch, is the only amount that you can have that is going to be workable and you can make a living on it. You can't make a living in this country on 160 acres. You might be able to in Kansas, because you have the farming, but in this country, which is arid and you can't grow that many crops. So it is just where you have cattle, and cattle you've got to feed during the winter if you're going to have the cow crop operation. And so there was these letters constantly coming to him. Every 3 or 4 or 5 months, "Perry, where is our money? Perry, we heard that you ran some cattle you pastured out some cattle. How much money did you make? What is our portion of this?" And so after 40 years of this, he made it known that he was going to sell. And this is the first large ranch in this area that sold. And here was my daddy in Kansas. He had gone through the Depression, he had gone through the Dust Bowl. And I should say our daddy, excuse me, Dad. He'd gone through the Depression, gone through the Dust Bowl, really poor, making it by renting a farm, and he and mother milked 20 cows every morning and every night.
Oh my God.
And that was during World War II. And that was during World War II. And you would have these big 5-gallon cream cans. And they would put the cream in the cream cans, haul it to where the train would pick up the cream. And then it would go out. And so our family had butter. Everybody else was eating margarine, but we had butter, which I think everybody's jealous of. But the train would pick up the cream cans and take them to wherever they went. And then the cans would come back with a check attached. And so you would pick up your cream can and take it and fill it and take it back. And so there was this continuous thing of the cream can being brought back with a check attached. And that's how they were able to get through the Depression. The Dust Bowl was a little bit more difficult, but that's how they got through the Depression. And then the banker, because Daddy and Mother were both such industrious people, the banker in McDonald, Kansas, which is where they were, money was beginning to loosen up during World War II, and offered Daddy money in order to do some investment. He went out and bought a small herd of cattle, put them on the farm, fed them out. He did this over a period of approximately 2 years and made enough money that he could follow his dream, which was to own a ranch in Colorado. And so in 1946, he and Mother went looking for that dream ranch in Colorado. They went to Paonia, but he couldn't find a ranch that was first on the water. He didn't want to be second or third or fourth on the water. He wanted to be first on the water around the Montrose area. Then he came to Steamboat Springs, and there were several people sitting out on one of the benches in front of the drugstore or the bar. I don't know which. Across the bar, you're right. And so he asked him if there was any cattle for sale, because he didn't want them to know that he was looking for a ranch. And they said, well, we don't know about cattle, but we know where there's a ranch for sale. And so that's when Daddy and Perry and Mother and Perry Clark got together. And when I went through the county records, I had some real surprises. One was that we moved here in March. The other is that the deed was not signed until October. So that means that Daddy and Mother picked up their 4 children, packed everything into an international truck with ropes wrapped around it, because I remember that quite plainly, and a car with their children, and my uncle drove, and these 2 vehicles left Goodland, Kansas at 4 o'clock in the morning, sometime in March. I don't remember the exact day. And we didn't get to Steamboat until about midnight. So we traveled that entire time, probably 20 or 30 miles an hour. I don't remember. I just knew it was forever. And when, I don't know where we slept, but the Clarks had already made arrangements for us to stay in their house. They knew we were coming with 4 children. They made arrangements for us just to stay in their house. So we slept someplace, I don't remember. But when we got up the next morning and went outside, my sister and I were standing there looking around. How did we get here? There was all these mountains with all of this snow. We had lived on the plains, and we said, how did we get here, for God's sakes? And so that was our introduction to Steamboat. But I cannot believe, and I really want to emphasize this, that on a handshake, that was how people did it at that time. On a handshake, my Mother and Daddy put us all into a truck, drove us to Steamboat, and we lived in the Clark house for 6 months while they negotiated. Now there was that land that lady had that went into the mental institution that Daddy wanted. Because that was an important part of the ranch. That was right at the bottom of Elk Mountain, over towards the Robinson place. It was some prime pasture land. And so he really wanted that. So he and Perry Clark negotiated for probably 2 months. And then finally Perry said, okay, I'll get her. I mean, I will make sure that I have a deed, and we will add that to the ranch. And so that was done. And then the other thing is, and this is gossip, but that makes it, since they're all dead, that makes it history. Lou Craig was married to Sarah Clark, and Lou Craig was a bit of a shyster. And Perry absolutely despised the man. And he was certain that Lou married his daughter, Sarah, because he wanted to inherit the ranch.
That would never happen in this day and age.
I'm sorry.
Say your parents' names for us.
Oh, my parents' names? You want their names? Willard F. and Helen Sherrod. Thank you. Okay. Yes, went by the name of Bill. And so there was also the negotiation going on with things like Lou Craig wanted the mineral rights because there had been, particularly on the across the river, because there had been a well drilled somewhere around Milner or something like that. There was some oil activity in that area, and he wanted those mineral rights. And then the other thing he wanted was he would like to have had all the land, but he wasn't going to get that. Perry made sure of that. But he also wanted the brand. And to get that Broken Box Bar brand, which was an old brand, he wanted that brand. And brands are very important in the West because all cattle have to have a brand inspection before they are sold. So they wanted to have, he wanted to have that brand. And so every time that he would try to get something from Perry, Daddy would see what was happening, and he would offer a lowball price, and Perry said, sure, I'll put that in with the sale. And so that was also part of the negotiation that went on for that 6 months in between when we moved in and when we actually owned the land.
What's the time frame? What was it?
This was in 1946. Yeah, this is March through October of 1946. And then, let me see. In your reply. Okay. Oh yeah, Perry was the other reason. Okay. I need to get my mind back in order here. Oh, the other thing I wanted to talk about was the deed. When I went through the county records, I just said, it can't be possible. This cannot be possible. I kept looking. I was in the oil business for a number of years. I can't tell you how many contracts I read. Hundreds. And I kept looking for more information. The deed was one letter-sized page. That's it. That transferred the Clark family stock company, the land, the irrigation, and a herd of cattle. That was done on one of these. That was it. Like I said, I kept looking for more. This was Munson. This was signed by Munson and pulled up by Nenson. He was the attorney here in Steamboat. In Hayden, it was Ferry Carpenter, but here it was Munson. So here was this two paragraphs that transferred all that. So the mentality of those people at that time was so much different. And that's not so long ago. That's 1946. Number one, Daddy felt comfortable making the move on a handshake, and everything was transferred with just being mentioned, just saying da-da-da-da-da-da, without all the other stuff. When we sold the ranch to our brothers, the paperwork was this thick. And it had numbers all the way down, so this happened, da-da-da-da. It was, the difference is just stark, and it's just one lifetime. Okay, and so then getting settled was difficult. The house was in horrible shape. It was just awful. We would sleep upstairs. It was open rafters, and the snow would come through. And then if you had anything that was sitting out, it would freeze. It would be frozen by morning. And so you'd have to get up and put on clothes that were cold, and only two stoves were in the house. One was in the kitchen, and a potbelly stove was in the living room. This was a fairly good-sized house. There was just, that's all the heat there was. And there was an outdoor toilet. You had to go out and pump your water. Now this is one country, when it gets 50 below zero, people, you can't imagine how much fun that is. To sit out on that cold stool as well as yeah. So one of the first things that my mother insisted is that this house had to have a few modern conveniences. And so Daddy had heard from Uncle Ernie. He lived on the farm right next to where the one that Daddy had leased. And he said, there's a volunteer crop of wheat coming up. And he said, you need to come and harvest it. And so whatever arrangements he made with the owners, I don't know, they had abandoned the farm basically. So he went back to Kansas and he harvested that wheat. My uncle tells me it was 30 to 40 acres, 30 to 40 bushels per acre. That would probably have been about, I'm guessing, 100 acres. And this was when we were feeding Europe. And for the first time, wheat prices were really, really high. And so I'm guessing he sold that wheat for about $3 a bushel, which was, it was 20 or 30 cents before that. So here he got a windfall. This wonderful windfall, which made my mother far more sane. She was having a really good time. But he was able to have this windfall. And also, we have to remember where we were in history at that time. This is right after World War II. And the factories were no longer making equipment for the war. They were retooling, and they were making equipment for the ranchers and farmers. Well, this area just was a horse country. That's just all there was. It was a horse country. But in Kansas, the farmers needed those tractors and that equipment in order to run these farms. And so with this windfall, he purchased a tractor that had a hydraulic lift on it. And all of the ranchers in this country had to use horses in order to hay. And so they would run the stack of hay or the bound of hay up these ramps, and then it would fall over. A good way to twist all the hay up as it was going so that it was really hard to stack. And besides, if you went a little bit too far and the plunger went over the top and hung over, it would take a long time to get it up. So he thought that was not a good way to hay. So he bought that tractor. And he really didn't have a way to get it home because it wouldn't fit in the international pickup. Besides, he had a lot of other things that he had to get. He needed to get plumbing supplies. He needed to get tin for the roof. He needed to fill up the truck with all this stuff. So that's when Toby came in our life. And Toby was this young kid from Missouri, probably about 18 years old, and he was hitchhiking to California. Oh. Well, at that time, almost everybody moved around the country hitchhiking. One of my friends in Denver, her mother hitchhiked back and forth to work between Colorado and Nebraska. My aunt left home by hitchhiking to Chicago. It's just how people moved around at that time. So here was Toby, and Daddy says, if you will drive the truck, I'm going to drive this tractor. So he drove this tractor all the way from Goodland, Kansas to Steamboat, probably about, yes, an hour. I know. I think it probably took him just a little bit longer on the second trip than it did the first trip, but not much. But he had something that wasn't in this valley, which was a tractor that could do the hydraulic lift. And so people would drive out on 44, and they would stop and watch Daddy hay with this hydraulic lift that you would push it like that and it would go over. It took 3 more years before they were able to get tractors into this country. And they had a John Deere place on Fifth. It's where the Good News building was. It's the one that blew up. And they've got the bicycle shop there now. But they finally got tractors in here. But it only lasted about 4 years because there just wasn't the need for tractors here like there were in Kansas and other places like that. And so he brought that tractor in. We got some plumbing. Mr. Carver came and helped Daddy put in the plumbing, which was, Mother said that he could have done a better job herself. But the plumbing worked somewhat, and we had running water, and we even had a water heater, and we could have hot running water. That was, we had moved uptown. And then Daddy did not like being in debt. The people at that time did not believe in being dead. At least he didn't, and most people didn't. So he sold half the herd. We drove half the herd into town. I can remember doing this. And the railroad corrals were down there about where Stinky Park is, and in that area someplace. And they would be able to get water. And then the cattle were loaded on the train and taken through Moffat Tunnel. And that's when the cattle stockyards were in Denver, not in Greeley. And so they went there, but I know. The buyers in Denver were always looking for cattle that had cinders on their backs, because that meant they went through the Moffat Tunnel. Yeah, and that meant that they had been fed out on this very rich grass here in this valley or one of the other mountain valleys. And so they would look for the cattle with cinders on their back. So when he sold that half of that herd, he was able to pay off Perry Clark. So by 1948, he owned the ranch, or my mother and father owned the ranch. And so he went from a dream in the 40s when he was so poor to owning the ranch by 1948. And that meant it got really difficult for all of us because there was not that much money coming in. And that's where Mother, who was such a industrious person and could cook anything and did. And so I can remember that we had this wood stove, and on the back over here, where it wasn't quite so hot, would be this big pot of milk. And it would slowly turn into cottage cheese and smell up the house until Daddy would walk in and say, "Oh God, when is that going to be done?" and she had her chickens, and she could put together a pie in about 20 minutes. All of her meals, we had a dessert. I mean, she was such a great cook. She also made all of her clothes, because we did not have enough money to make clothes. To go out and buy clothes. So this is a person that really worked hard. My father did too, obviously. But this was what was on the back of women. All these women, all these 40% of these homesteaders that made it on the back of the women. I hate to tell you that, you guys out there. But the women, they almost always had a child every year. If not, it was every other year. They had to make their own soap, as well as wash their clothes with a scrubber, as well as do a garden. They had to do all of this from early in the morning until late at night. These are the people that this 160 acres rested on. were these women. I know you guys think it was the men, but having been in that house and seeing how hard Mother worked, it was the women that put all of this together. And so I was going to do some skipping around a little bit and talking a little bit more about the people in the valley, particularly Jenny Hitchens. She was the person who put all of the information in the Steamboat Pilot, the Mystic News, every year. I mean, every week. And so she would listen on the party line, the telephone party line. And she would get the information that was going to go into the pilot, and this would go into the Mystic Route. Sometimes my mother would, I'm sure my mother often fed her information. But this was our weekly entertainment, to see what Jenny put into the paper. And she also had another habit, and Charlene, I'm going to need your help with this. What were her two sisters' names? I know that one was Maggie Steves. What was the other one?
Two Stevens.
Oh, Two Stevens. Oh, yes. Jenny Hitchens, Maggie Steves, and Sue Stevens would get in their car, and they would sit on Main Street. Now, she says in front of the Pioneer, which was a local, which is where all the drunks went.
Or the theater.
Yes. Yeah, or the theater. But I would see her in front of Allen's and Lights, so the three of them. They would talk about everyone. If it, oftentimes I think that what ended up in the paper was often from sitting there and watching people. So I went to the Steamboat Pilot, and I cut out some of those wonderful things. I did it about the Sherrods. There was one here I wanted to read that was really funny. Bill Sherrod, W.M. Carver, and J.B. Cross have finished putting up their alfalfa crop. The local frost has done much damage to the alfalfa and gardens. The hobo, if you can remember, the hobo galloping tea group took time off Wednesday afternoon to go to the home of Marie Stender. Not finding Mrs. Stender at home, the lady stopped at the home of Mrs. Ralph Weeks, where tea and visiting was enjoyed. There were 12 ladies and 12 children to make the trip in Mary Duncan's truck. So that would be something that would be in the paper. So it kind of caught me up also on the family news. And I can see where it says Bill Sherrod. Bill Sherrod is the first in the neighborhood to start spring calving. So far, it has been nice weather. Mr. and Mrs. Chester Hitchens made a brief call Tuesday to the John Creek home to wish them well on their 50th anniversary. So we know two things: that the weather was rather good, and that they had gone to this party. Okay, Mrs. Bill Sherrod was the winner last year. Okay, this is really important. This changed my mother's life. Mrs. Jack May won the cotton bag sewing contest at the state fair. This is the second winner from this community. Mrs. Bill Sherrod was the winner last year. Both received new sewing machines as rewards. And this is when my mother had the treadle machine. My grandfather, I'm going to go back up here. My grandfather believed in every one of his daughters having a vocation. All of my aunts, except for my mother and the next one, went through college. They went to major. So in the case of my mother, because she was so artistic, and she could sew so well, they sent her to someplace in Nebraska. I think it was Lincoln, where she studied tailoring, and so she was this absolutely fabulous seamstress. And so she entered this contest when she heard about it, and so she won this Foth sewing machine. Now, Pfaff was one of the best sewing machines out there at that time. This is when the German stuff was just beginning to come into America. We had forgiven them for the war. beginning to import their machines. And so it took her a couple of days because she had to play, because it went so fast. And she was just, oh my God. But from that, she was able to make anything. She could upholster with it. Excuse me, and she did. She entered a number of contests. She entered leather contests. She could sew leather. She could sew all of this stuff. And so Daddy had a jacket that she had taken scraps of leather and put together. And it was in all these different squares and different everything. And this jacket, this leather jacket, is what he would wear to the stock show when he would go to Denver, and also around town. I mean, he was very proud of this. And it fit him, perfectly. Nothing she'd ever made anything that wasn't perfect. In fact, she was on her death. We had her at home. She was dying. We had her in the middle of the living room. We were all gathered around her. We were having this big party. But my niece had to leave, and Mother just turned and looked, and she said, "Nicole, that doesn't fit right. You need to take that belt off of that skirt and refix that." She expected everything to be made perfect and to fit perfectly, and so she did that. Changed that. Winning that machine changed her life. She made so many wonderful things, and they were all well tailored. And she became, in the community, the one that was making stuff. But also, she, for 49 years, this is funny. She actually only was a forage leader for 49 years. But she wanted the 50-year pin, and she was dying. So she went to the county agent and said, "I want my 50-year pin." And he did not dare not give it to her. So she got her 50-year pin. But for 49 years, she taught sewing in this valley to so many young people. We received letters for a number of years afterwards for these young people to say what a difference it made in their life that she had spent this much time with them and taught them sewing. And of course, this is a non-paying job. I mean, this is to be a support of the community. My parents were both community builders. My mother in her sewing, my daddy in his cattle. And I came across something in one of Jimmy's articles here that, okay, Bill Sherrod given awards at the brush show. That's not the one I want. Let me see. Willard Sherrod, prominent shorthorn rancher in Elk River, donated this is the one I want. Donated 2 choice calves to the ketchup contest. These calves weighed 450 pounds when they were taken to the show and were the 2 top steer calves produced by the Sherrods. Now, Sherrod Cowhorn this past year. They were caught by Everett Stencil, Greeley, Colorado, and Gary Dalquist of Kelsey, Kansas. The calves will be fattened by these boys and brought back to the National Western Stock Show next year, where they will be shown in the special class of ketchup contest calves. There were 32 calves caught this year, and 16 being Herefords, 8 Shorthorns, and 8 Angus. Sherrod made a special inducement to these 2 boys by offering them to double their prize winner money. If they won a prize, he was going to double their money. He did that basically because he was giving steers away to young people whose families could not afford them, and he knew what it was like to be poor, and we all did. So if there was somebody that wanted to have a calf, he would donate them to him. But if they didn't take care of it properly, which oftentimes happened, or happened enough that he made sure the family he gave it to was going to take good care of that calf. And so by the catch-a contest at the National Stock Show, for them to say they had to bring it back and show it the next year was an incentive for them to take care of that calf. And so that was important. And so he did that for a number of years, as well as he worked with the forage kids, and he would be at the ring when the kids were showing, and he'd go up to me and say, "The judge is looking for this." And so he'd say, "Stand over here, the judge is looking for this." And so he would help the kids. He would be whispering to them, because he would always be working in the ring, and he would be whispering to him, "This is what the judge is looking for. You want to do this, you want to." But that is the ones up and down the Elk River. Now the ones from Yampa, the kids from Yampa, now that didn't apply. Anyway, this gives you a bit of a history of that area, of my family, how we came into the valley, of the other people who lived in that valley, and had this 160 acres. And I really, really want to honor all of those people who managed to take those 160 acres and make something of it. Because this changed America more than anything else. Because that meant the people owned the land, not the government, which is how almost all other societies are set up. And so this really changed, and it took a lot of people who worked really, really, really hard in order to do it. And it was done in 2, maybe 3 generations. That's the most interesting thing of all. Thank you all very much for coming.
Great job, Sandra.
Thank you. What? Oh, I thought you were going to ask your question. No, okay.
No.
Okay, now Marabou. And the ones of us that did not want to be a part of the ranch were bought out by the 2 brothers who now own everything that's on the north side of the river. The south side of the river became Marabou, and that's what was sold. And then the 4 of us who did not want, the 3 of us who did not want to be a part of that, in order to settle the estate, because we all owned 1/6. Daddy took really, he was very, very up on this. And in the 1970s, it was in 1970s. Yeah, it had to be in the 1970s. He came to Denver and he said, "I want to find an attorney that we can transfer this land to you kids." Because he saw what happened to several of the ranches, in which the government, by the time that the state was settled, they had to sell a large part of the property in order to pay the taxes. And so, in fact, it's still a problem. It's really hard to pass from one generation to another. But he got this attorney he began passing off to the 6 of us an X amount of acres every year, until after about 5 or 6 years he had transferred it all to the 6 of us. And so when my parents died, my father first, he was killed. I don't know if I should tell all this on him, but I will. He and that river had a contest. And when in 1982, when he was 72, he lost the contest. The river won, and he was drowned in 1982. It was one of those things in which I'm not so sure. Well, never mind. I can't speculate here. But anyway, he died in 1982, and then Mother lived for another 15, 16 years, and she died in 2001. Yeah, and so we had to settle the estate after that. It had to be settled. And I'm telling you, you cannot, everybody on these ranches has a horrible time settling these estates, because people love the land. They don't know what to do with it. Some of them want to make money off of it. Some of them want to put it into conservancies. You know, it goes on and on like that. Our family ended up selling everything across the river, which was almost 400 acres, maybe a little bit more. And then bought out the three of us that no longer wanted to be a part of it. And then the other two brothers owned everything across the river, all the way up mountain. And so they own the majority of it. They own, I think, about 1,200 acres. So, yes, ma'am.
When did your parents move into town?
I'm sorry.
When did your folks move into town?
My mother moved into town after Daddy died. She moved into town in 1985. And my sister lives in the house that she was in on Pine Street. Yeah. Anything else?
How old were your parents when they passed?
My father was 72, my mother was 90. She had her 90th birthday. We all came home and celebrated her 90th birthday. She had pneumonia 3 years in a row. There was nothing else wrong with it. She was such a healthy thing. And she got pneumonia again. And I had come home and stayed with her for a month. And she kind of said, I don't know what's going to happen to me, da-da-da-da-da-da. She said, should I check out this home? Should I do this? And I knew by the time I left that she'd made up her mind what she was going to do. So when she got pneumonia the next year, she had Delbert call all of us and say, she refused all medicine. This is it. I'm dying. This is it. So we all came home and we put her on a bed in the middle of the living room. We showed movies. Jackie was cooking for 35 people. All these people came in, and she forgot why she was there. She thought it was a family. And she would wake up every morning, and the nurse would be there, and they would talk. And I would just say, "Oh God, Mother, remember why you called us?" So finally, after about, I think, we were there for a week. I mean, we were leaving jobs to come back. We wanted to say, Mother, we're on a schedule here. My sister owned at that time a travel agency in Washington, D.C., and she made arrangements for everyone to come back. My sister-in-law is here in Steamboat, found places for everyone to stay. And so it was a family reunion. And then finally, my mother's sisters started all coming, and my mother said, "Oh, I'm not supposed to be here." and so she passed. And I have to tell this thing because we have the graveyard that's out there just above the Sherrod Ranch, and that's where the Mungers are buried, and that's where the Robinsons and the Blanfords, and I understand others are coming in. But I'm on the board. It's a large cemetery with not that many people, and we invite people. But anyway, we had the funeral. It's in April, and they decided not to dig the grave because it was going to be really muddy for people standing around. And so when we left, my mother's casket was sitting on top of the ground. My sister and I would not leave town until we were certain the brothers had dug the hole and had buried Mother, because there was no way we were going to get on that plane knowing that if we weren't absolutely positive she was in ground. So there's a lot more stories. In fact, I have this friend in Texas. He's a really good art friend of mine, and he'd say, "Tell me a story." And in a second, I could come up with a big story about growing up on a ranch. And he said, "Oh, I would have loved that." He said, "I grew up in New York City in the Bronx. My father drove the subway car. He went around the same track every day, all day long. He went home, and we ate in silence." There was no silence on our house ever, unless we were all asleep. And so he would say, you just don't know how lucky you are to have had this. And Daddy used to say, it's no way to make a living, but it's a good way to raise kids. So that's it. Anything else?
Thank you.
Thank you.